Hi, my name is Alexis. My pronouns are she, hers. This is Connor, pronouns he, him, and they, them. And this is Sam, pronouns she, hers, and they, them. And today we're here to give you guys the foundations and practices of restorative justice. So if you're looking to learn more about restorative justice, you're in the right place.
So for this presentation, we're going to be talking through kind of restorative justice by definition, what it is. We'll talk about the roots and foundations and history around it. We'll talk about restorative frameworks, so like headspaces around it and traditional modes of discipline, particularly in the United States, and then how restorative frameworks differ from that. And then we'll talk about applications. So restorative practice in education is a major application of this type of justice.
And then before we begin with all of our presentation, we also just want to ground and acknowledge the land that we're on. So given that we're on a webinar, everyone is on different land, I'm presuming, so we all need to acknowledge the different land that we're on that is stolen from Indigenous peoples. So for example, Alexis and Sam are both in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm here in Gurnee, Illinois. And I would recommend all of you go to https / native/land.ca. So again, native-land.ca. And you can type in your zip code and learn what land that you are on and acknowledge that with us during this process. And I also want to acknowledge that Sam and I are both white. And so part of our framework and our presence and our ancestry is linked with colonization. And we want to acknowledge that whiteness is present with us throughout this presentation and when we do this work. And so for acknowledging the land, so we are on native lands, lands from which the Dakota, the Peoria, the Kickapoo, and people who are from these nations were forcibly removed, and the land was built up with stolen bodies and stolen resources. This land carries the stories of the Dakota, the Peoria, and the Kickapoo, of their struggles for survival and identity, and it also carries their resilience and wisdom. And so again, I really encourage you to go learn more about whose stories are part of land you are on at native-land.ca, and also learn more about land acknowledgements. It's not my knowledge to teach nor appropriate for me, so I highly recommend looking at Indigenous scholars teaching about those topics.
Just to kind of start us off, we thought we would open with this quote by Fanya Davis from her book Race and Restorative Justice. Restorative justice is a new but old justice that is healing, relational, community-based, inclusivist, participatory, needs and accountability-based, and forward-looking. So we really wanted to start with this quote because I think it opens up this discussion really well about restorative justice. It's kind of a blanket statement explaining all the things that we are going to be talking about, and that restorative justice is not just one aspect. There are so many different things that go into restorative justice that make it what it is. And again, it's important to note that, like it says in the beginning, it's a new but old justice. So although restorative justice is kind of making its way into popular culture and people are paying more attention to it, the ideas and the values that it comes from have been around for a long time. And so these things that we are working with now are not new. They did not just show up today. We're going to do a quick activity to kind of get everyone in this restorative mindset. So we're going to do this activity that talks about harms and needs, which is something that is very important in restorative justice. So before we really get into everything, we want to kind of get everybody into the same mind frame. So first, if you have the dialogue journal, if you have a piece of paper, if you're taking notes somewhere, if you're better at visualizing, however things work best for you, do what you need to do. But do whatever you need to do to answer this first prompt of think of a time you were harmed. What did you need? And now, think of a time you harmed someone. What did you need then? All right, so I know I've given you a lot of big ideas of what restorative justice is, but I have yet to give you a solid definition. So that's what we're going to do now. So what is restorative justice? Restorative justice is less concerned with the laws that are broken, but the relationships that have been harmed. So it's a community-based way, and you're addressing harm through dialogue, accountability, and collective healing. So the ways that they do that, or the pillars of restorative justice, are harms and needs, obligations, and engagement. So harms and needs, much like the activity we just did, is just kind of figuring out like what are the needs of the parties involved? The ones who've done the harm, the ones who've been harmed, like what are the needs? And then how can that harm be like repaired overall? And again, obviously you need to figure out who was harmed and what the harm exactly was and identify that. So next in obligations, it's about responsibility and accountability. So again, who was harmed, who was the one who did the harm, but it's really important to note that this is not a binary in any way. So just because someone is deemed the person who has been harmed doesn't mean that they have not done any harm. So it's not one or the other, it's a both and situation. And then with engagement, again, when we were talking about like the communities involved, like everybody is involved. It is not just a few people making the decision. So again, it's the communities of both parties involved. And it's so that it's not something that they're told to do, but something that everyone collaborates to try to figure out collectively how they're going to address and repair the harm in relationship. When learning or utilizing restorative justice practices, it would be completely amiss to continue doing so without acknowledging the indigenous roots that restorative justice has. As Connor alluded to during the land acknowledgement, there are so many indigenous practices and ways of life that were completely altered and destroyed after colonization, and conception of justice are no different from that. They are not excluded from that. So, what we're going to do now is kind of highlight a few different cultural conceptions and cultural ways of justice that inform the current restorative justice to kind of play homage to the roots and to acknowledge that it did not just show up today, and this is not something that a bunch of white people came up with. And just to note, although we are only highlighting four, like again, this is a highlight. There are so many other cultures, and these are not the only collectivist cultures. Like, just remember that there's more research to be done, and I encourage you to look more things up and to be investigative in where restorative justice, what is rooted in. But for right now, we are just doing four. So, firstly, looking at Ubuntu, it's a Nguni Bantu word, Bantu of South Africa. And as it says on the screen, the whole concept is I am because we are. And so it really highlights the importance of the fact that your self is intertwined with all these other people around you, and you cannot separate yourself from that. So it's like your independence is like entwined with other people. And it's really about encouraging community equality, and community relations, since your personhood is so reliant and so intertwined with other people's. So it's like you owe other people humanities to have your own humanity. The next one, which is the concept of Naye. So, like Navajo law is based in this concept, which it's basically this person who has been harmed is looking for the acknowledgement of their own harm, and that they're again not concerned with the intent or the causation of the fault or negligence of whoever it was that caused the harm, but they're more concerned with their harm being acknowledged and then the relationship that was then harmed to be repaired, because it's also that relationship that was harmed is now harming the community as a whole, because they also have focused on the interconnectedness of people. And in these situations, to restore the relationships and repair the harm, it was a community based thing, and they would use a process of horizontal justice, which is the complete opposite of what we use now, which is vertical justice. And vertical justice uses a hierarchy, whereas horizontal justice, everyone is equal and on the same level. So, as you can see on the graphic, everyone seems to be sitting in a circle, and that's what they are doing. So, everyone is equal, no one is above or below anyone. And here they would hold a discussion to decide what is going to be best to restore the relationship with the community. And most importantly, they needed to come to a consensus about the decisions so that no one felt like they were getting like the short end of the stick, so that everyone could succeed in this situation, seeing again as everyone's humanities are intertwined here as well. All right. Mitikuye Oyasin is a Lakota term or Lakota phrase. And again, it's just another way that we wanted to highlight how all these other cultures are so embedded in interconnectedness. So this is about the sacred interconnectedness held between all the Lakota people in North America, and something that affects one of them is going to affect all of them, no matter the distance between them. And it's also used in a lot of prayers. but it's just really important to note that there's cultures everywhere where their own humanity is dependent and intertwined with the humanity of the people around them. And then lastly, this is a cool one with the Tlingit people of the Yukon, First Nations people, is that this is like one of the first times that these ideals of justice and interconnectedness and community were able to come together and work with the modern conceptions of justice. So um, up in the Yukon, there was a village that came together to create peacemaking circles to work in conjunction with the Alaskan state government to deal with underage drinking on the reservations. Um, and they did so by holding peacemaking circles, and the community would decide what the youth would need to do to make things right and make things better and heal the relationships in the community. And the youth were much more apt to adhere to the things that they were asked of them because they were being held accountable by their community and people that they knew that their success impacted as well. Unlike if it was just with a regular court, they didn't have any sort of connection to those people. But by being held accountable to people that they feel like their lives are intertwined with, they were more likely to succeed and repair the relationships.
Thank you so much, Alexis, for sharing all of that. And I want to reiterate the point that Alexis made about just how these indigenous conceptions and frameworks of justice, interconnectedness is throughout cultures across the world, but really we see a presence and a real power in this when we talk about the frameworks of how restorative justice operates. And so I'm going to take a moment to talk about different frameworks of justice, specifically looking at how a lot of restorative justice frameworks contrast really from how our current Western North American justice system, specifically the United States, operates. And so first, I want to begin with the restorative paradigm. Earlier, we talked about the three pillars of restorative justice, which have been identified by Howard Zehr, who is considered the grandfather of restorative justice since the 1970s, talking about how bringing it into our criminal punishment system. And we also want to highlight that we use different labels than a lot of other colleagues in restorative justice. So often you'll see the victim, the offender, and the community in this triangle. And what we have is the person harmed, the person who caused harm, and the community. And these labels, and why I prefer them as personally, is because a person is not the sum of their misdeeds. And so I think, or just like the sum of their negative experiences, I don't think it's fair to label someone a victim in a process and refer to them as that. I think it removes some autonomy and agency. And I think it also erases a lot of the humanity to call someone an offender. And so I really challenge people when they think of using the terms victim and offender, whether it's applied to restorative justice, whether it's applied to criminal justice as a whole, talking about offenders or inmates, think about how our labels and how we talk about the individuals engaged in harm processes are erased by the words or altered by the words that we use. And then finally, the community is part of this as well. And community is defined as individuals who are connected to both the person harmed and the person who caused harm. It's about the people who can help be accountable. It's the people who can support and uplift. And it's important that we have our community part of this because that is how restorative justice sees change happening in individuals and in communities. It's through this connectedness. And I also want to highlight, earlier Alexis referred to how the person harmed or person who caused harm, it's often not a binary. We'll see in our schoolwork that we do as an organization where it's actually it's really messy and unclear. The person who was harmed could also have caused harm to the individual. So we need to really erase that binary thinking of, oh, well, this is the person who brought the report to an administrator, so that means they are the person who was harmed. And just recognize that restorative justice really involves context as well. And so it's not as clean cut, and it actually erases situations in harm when you are labeling someone as only the person who was harmed and neglecting the harm that might have caused the other person or individuals. And so talking about punitive versus restorative, for those who haven't heard the word punitive before, it relates to like a temperament of punishment behind a lot of how we address things. And so punitive questions that we see in our criminal legal system and criminal punishment systems is, what was the rule? Who broke it, and what is the punishment? So, I mean, in my experience growing up, it was just like, we have our house rules. And if I ran in the house and broke something, I broke the rules, so that I am punished. And when we think of that, like, then it contrasts to restorative questions, right? Where restorative questions ask, like, what was the harm? The harm in that case is that I broke something that was valuable to my parents. And who was impacted? My parents were impacted by it. And like, and I have the obligation to set it right. So who has the obligation to set it right? So restorative questions, you can see it's less concerned with like these abstract rules that no one really, very few people have power to shape, and then don't really have true investment in it. Rather, restorative questions are looking at the harm, the impact, and who needs to set it right. And that's how we're repairing harm, rather than the punishment is immediately going to make things better, or assuming that all people who are harmed just want to see punishment, because that often offers people so little. And to get from those punitive and restorative frameworks, we need to have a few restorative shifts. Restorative justice, I don't want us to think that it is just these handy little tools that we can pull out what's convenient for us and then resume to our punitive mindset. It is truly, restorative justice is a social movement that truly calls on us to change how we approach each other as people in our environments. So we're going from telling to knowing the answers and assuming other people's lives, from institutions and third parties trying to restore balance, to a focus on the wrongdoer. If we look at our criminal punishment system, it is entirely focused on the external coercion of the person who caused harm. And it is so often not focused on the person who was harmed and meeting those needs. And so we're shifting from those things to listening, to being curious. When you are working with students and you're like, well, I know this student, you don't know the answers. I remember one of my mentors, Dr. Madison, talked about how you've only known this person for 15 minutes. Or if you're walking into a session with someone you've never met, you can't make assumptions of what they did was wrong because you know so little context. So being curious and listening are core. Those who are effective restore the balance. So instead of relegating to this adversarial legal system where you have a prosecutor and defender duking it out, it's those who were directly involved restore the balance. And sometimes there's ways where that's not possible. We can get into that later. Focus on those harmed and those who caused harm. And so it's both of those needs and obligations are present. And then finally, it's internal motivation and accountability. And to be involved in restorative processes, it cannot involve, I see sometimes in education systems, principals or administrators will tell students, if you go through the mediation, we're gonna have to expel you. And that actually disrupts the process from the beginning, because there is external coercion, and that is not a restorative process. People need to choose to be accountable. We cannot force accountability on other people, because that will only cause more harm in the future. And so if you're thinking, well, I don't know what to ask, or this is very different to me, or if this is very familiar to you, we just want to offer some restorative questions that you can use. So instead of doing, why did you do, like why this, or you knew that was wrong, ask what happened. Also, like, what were you thinking or feeling at the time? And what have you thought and felt since? And something that Alexis and I have been reflecting on is when we think about, sometimes students, if they don't offer you an answer of like, what were you thinking or feeling at the time, there's neurobiological reasons for that. So if someone has incurred or endured a lot of trauma in their life at a very young age, also when working with youth, people under the age of 26 don't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, which is that critical decision making. And so we're working with people who don't have a fully developed brain. So they're obviously not going to go through the whole, well, this is happening where someone's coming at me. What are the implications of my actions? What do I need to do? What are my surroundings? Where like a lot of times when people have endured trauma, your brain will go straight from, oh, someone's coming at me, I gotta act, I gotta defend myself. And so students, if in the example of physical fight, they might not know what they were thinking, they just acted, and that's valid. And you can't go from that, well, it's like, well, I saw you fight, what were you thinking? They might legitimately not know, and that's okay. that you can ask other questions to try to build context rather than just focusing on the individual moment and building story out from that moment. So other questions you ask is, who has been affected and how, in your opinion? What do you think needs to happen to make things right? How can you all address these needs together? And I think this is where restorative justice differs from just being a good listener. It's, what support do you need? What is we of the community can offer you to support you to make these, to correct these harms? Or if the person was harmed, what can we do to support you so that you can heal and move forward? So ultimately, what we're talking about in restorative justice is more about learning, storytelling, and context building rather than telling, scolding, and punishing. People are more accountable to relationships than rules. And that is a bit of wisdom that one of my mentors, Sam Coltes, who is wonderfully going to talk next about all of their experiences. It's that we as individuals, I'm going to be more accountable to my friends, to my family, to the community, the members that I see every single day, rather than arbitrary rules that I have no stake in, or rules that I might see as unjust and that do not represent my values or visions for what society in my area or my community's needs. And then traditional versus restorative approaches to discipline. And I just want to be clear on the differentiating between traditional and Western. So like when we say traditional, often that can harken back to when we're thinking about like Indigenous or First Nations people, we're talking traditional in the Western sense in our modern context. So we're talking about how we do things now versus restorative approaches to discipline. And so often we see this two-dimensional discipline continuum in our schools, in our courts, and in other systems. It's that we are either punitive, where it is so focused on punishment, and we have highly regulated, stringent rules where if you fall from them, you're done and you are going to be punished. Or we see this other extreme where we are very permissive and we understand that there is a harder context. But what we do is that so for example, I worked with a student who had a lot going on in their life, but they were actively causing harm to all the students in the community around them. And so what we couldn't do is just excuse that all the trauma they're going through doesn't necessarily, it needs to be acknowledged, but does not allow them to actively continue to cause harm to others. Rather than viewing how we address harm, or rather discipline, and how we discipline people through the binary of punitive or permissive, the multidimensional discipline model actually provides a really helpful way for us to frame how systems work and how restorative justice fits into that system and what conditions are necessary for restorative justice to exist. And so through this traditional model, we see two different axes. We have control and support. And actually, I think control isn't the word that I like to associate with anything that is restorative. So I'm going to use accountability instead of control. And so from this model, we can see punitive, restorative, neglectful, and permissive. So if we have low accountability and low support, that's just neglecting people. That is not seeing justice. That is not doing anything for anyone. However, if we have a high accountability, high process, high amount of ways that people need to do something, as we see in our current legal system, there is literally pages and pages and books of like rules and procedure. But if there's little support and care about the person and how that person is encouraged to go through the process, it's punitive. It is doing something to someone. And then we also, on the other extreme, have, if we have high encouragement and nurture but very little accountability, that's being permissive. That's doing things for people. And we see that a lot in white supremacy culture, whereas in Minnesota, we have majority white teachers. And we can at times see how we do things for people, that white saviorism concept, where doing things for people actually allows them to continue potentially harming someone or not necessarily transforming behavior. I had a student that was really, I enjoyed a lot, but they caused a lot of harm in spaces. And I couldn't just provide support and not accountability because they were going to continue harming students in this support group. So restorative ways of being require not only high accountability and high process, but also high support. Restorative is ongoing. Restorative is in community. Restorative is in relationship rather than just process and accountability, and rather than just um, supporting and uplifting someone. So that is doing things with people. And so I just want to remind people that when we are being restorative, we are doing things with. We are not doing things to, and we are not doing things for people. Our language matters in this conversation. I would love you all to take a moment and just reflect on a couple of discussion prompts. If you were writing with a pencil, write with a pencil or pen, writing utensil, stunning. Or if you just want to think about it in your beautiful brain, go for it. But how is restorative justice different from the current criminal punishment system? And my second question is, I'm curious where would you place your middle and high schools on the multidimensional discipline model? And why would you place them there?
Thanks, Connor. This is Sam coming back, and we are going to move into kind of that question set us up great for moving into restorative practice and education. And one of the reasons that we are talking about this is because this presentation is kind of geared towards educators, and we ourselves, the three of us, are people who do restorative practice in schools as our background and jobs, day-to-day jobs. So one of the reasons that this is important is because while restorative practice is a long historied and community-based practice, one of the places it's been the most publicized is in the education system, and often it is framed as a program and a way to reform disciplinary policies. And while those things are true, that's sort of a two-dimensional explanation of it. So I want to talk a little bit more about what that actually means. Sharing this quote from Denise Breton. She is a restorative practitioner and author from Minnesota and South Dakota, sorry. And this quote is, "Tracing the history of colonization that has characterized North America, it does not make sense to hold an indigenous person accountable for drug possession or stealing a car while we fail to hold ourselves accountable for genocide we committed so we could steal an entire state's worth of land. If we are serious about restorative justice and education, addressing historical harms is part of the work." And this quote gets at what Alexis had been sharing about with the historical roots of restorative practice, but also what Connor was getting at with the kind of larger frameworks around traditional punitive systems and the way that they address individuals. And this addresses that there's way more to the story. One of the other things, and this part of the presentation, these two slides could have their own presentation, and they really ought to. Maybe that's a follow-up that we do. But another resource that I just want to make sure that you have so that you can do some thinking about it in your own time is Maisha Wynn's book called Justice on Both Sides, Transforming Schools Through Restorative Justice. And one of the learnings in there is about 4 pedagogical stances. So history matters as the outermost ring, race matters within that, justice matters within that, and then language matters at the center. So this sort of also, the beginning of the presentation set you up for this slide. And ultimately, one of the things that restorative approaches need to be grounded in is equity and equity work. And all of that relational harm takes place in a much broader context. And we live in a culture that is just built up on historical harm and values whiteness and devalues blackness, and that shows up in many of our punitive systems, in all of our punitive systems. Okay, so we have examples of many places that have had success in reforming their school culture to be restorative. Um, the way that that is done is there's a great example of a school in Shoreview near the Twin Cities Metro that at the beginning of each year, the school has its students come up with guidelines and values for the year, and then they paint over last year's guidelines and rules and put them on the, and then have the new students paint them onto the wall. So they're operating by guidelines of their choice over that time, and that sort of sets the groundwork for the year ahead. This is about asking your community how it wants to operate and understanding that school relationships are really built off of those day-to-day interactions, and that breaches in community and breaches in relationship impact the way that school operates. And all of that is founded on sort of this community building sense. And often that's done through circle processes, which Alexis shared about with regard to the Klingit model, and other ways of kind of having group dialogue and group quality time and community building and relationship building. So there's kind of tiers to the processes that go into schools operations, and the goals are kind of from a community-based level to affirm relationships, to keep relationships healthy, build an emotional bank account. Harm will probably happen in many situations, so having mechanism to repair those relationships when that harm does occur in real time is also important. And then rebuilding those relationships if there is history of harm, if things don't go right, if there is just a whole bunch of context to every situation. So when new people get brought into those spaces, or really, really big breaches in community happen, those people have to be brought up to speed and welcomed. And so these are examples of ways that those happen. So at the bottommost level, there's community peace building circles, and that's indigenous model of group dialoguing with often using a talking piece and opening and closing. It's very ritualized, very process based. Kind of within the next section is problem solving and repairing relationship practices, and those are done with kind of just the people involved, but also it's mostly focused on interpersonal and like problem based content. Beyond that, there's this tier of involving the community and addressing context. And families are as much a part of the community of schools as teachers and administrators and students are. So making sure to include those folks in processes, because ultimately situations impact them as well. One of the most important things to understand about any of these processes is that they are it's restorative headspace is an impulse and a way of life. So teachers teach in classrooms, and then there's kind of the social aspects of school as well. Holding yourself and carrying yourself in a restorative way means that it is in conflict with punishment systems, because there are so many rules and guidelines that function that cause the functions in schools. And so when you bump up against those things and add humanity to them, it causes this really human process to be often turned into additional tools of punishment. And kind of like Connor was alluding to, there you can call something restorative, but if it's not centered in the relationship, it's coercive, and the process isn't effective, and it becomes, for lack of better words, bastardized. But a practice that has seen a lot of success and kind of is the groundwork of building the emotional bank account so that you can repair relationships within those communities is community peace building circles. And one of the things that when an ongoing community peace building circle is set up in a community, we do we build that up and build the kind of the container of the circle to hold good things and hard things through talking about our values. The values are the foundation on which people carry themselves, are accountable to each other, operate in moral standing. And then we build our community guidelines based on those values. So, examples of values that people offer are things like respect, humor, compassion, patience, honesty, truth, grit, um, and giving people example or moments to kind of explain what their mode of operation when they show up in spaces. So I want you as a group to spend a little bit of time practicing this. So in your dialogue journals or whatever you have, if you're doing a writing activity in front of you, I want you to think about the way that I usually frame this for myself is what is a value that you hold or try to act on in both good times and hard times, and why? What does it mean to you? So please think about that, write that down, spend some time, and then take the time to share it. And then maybe once everybody's shared, take an opportunity to give folks to respond to each other if they can. And here are the resources page that we put into a lot of this presentation informed our wisdom. And we are really thankful that you spent time listening to us, and please contact us.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.